I knew that in between the last series and the start of Lent, I had 3 weeks. And I thought briefly about doing like a short little series, but then I thought, nah, one-offs are good too. I'm just going to do 3 one-off sermons. And you know what happened? They turned into a series, an unintentional series. What's more interesting to me, though, is that in the absence of a plan for the 3 weeks ending today, all 3 sermons ended up with overtones of the turmoil that's in our world right now. You know, as I was starting this unintentional mini-series, Minneapolis was happening. Of course, there have been so many things over the last year, over the last decade or so. There's been so much turmoil in our country and in our politics and in our society. So perhaps it's because I'm reflecting what I hear from you all. Perhaps it's what's on my own heart. Perhaps it's the Holy Spirit helping me to hear what all of us need to hear. And so I hope that you listen closely this morning, because it's moments like this and sermons like these sometimes that God uses to speak to us most deeply. And maybe it's not even what I say. Maybe it's your wandering mind or something tangential that occurs to you. Listen, because that's how God speaks in these moments. And I've seen it happen so many times, and I know it will happen today. So, the thrilling conclusion to an unintentional mini-series that perhaps we all need to hear. And today's is a sermon about control and how we don't always have it. So, 2 weeks ago, Moses went up the mountain. Now, this was a major story in the Bible. In fact, one of those pivotal stories upon which most of the Bible is based, and so many refer back to it, at least the broader story, when Moses is given the law. And law is definitely too small of a word for it. We don't have a perfect translation in English. Torah is the Jewish word, the Hebrew word, and it means God's teaching, God's instruction, God's formation. And the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and as the ancient myth is passed down, the Torah was given from God to Moses when he was on the mountain. It was also, though, the beginning of a time that was going to be quite difficult for the Israelites, of wandering through the desert as they began this new journey, becoming God's people through the Torah. By this point, Moses had seen so many amazing things. He'd received God's name through the burning bush. I love these ancient stories that pass down this wisdom to us, whether they happened literally that way or not. He'd seen God's amazing actions, like the parting of the Red Sea, for instance. But now he's afraid, because he knows that this is going to be not just a fast thing. This is going to be a long term. For 40 years, they're going to be in the desert, and he's worried they're going to lose their sight. They're going to lose their vision. And he doesn't quite trust that God will stay with them. And so he says, God, may I see you? May I see you so that I'll know that you are with us. And God says, no one could see me and live. It's more than you could handle. Your nervous system could not handle seeing me, is God's reply. But I will hide you in the crack in the rock and place my hand over you. And after I pass, you may see my back. And generations have taken this to mean that we usually can't see where God is. It's more than we could handle anyway. But it's easier to see where God just was. And sometimes seeing where God just was gives us the confidence that God is still with us now, even though we can't see it. Moses wants assurance. But what he really wants is control, doesn't he? He wants to be sure that God is indeed he wants to be sure that God really is in control as things get ready to get difficult. But God says, you're not going to have the assurance. That's not how life works. Seeing where I just was will be enough. Moses looked for certainty. Moses looked for certainty about the future. But in last week's sermon about Elijah, Elijah looks for something very different. He looks for certainty about God's behavior. So last week, Elijah goes up the mountain, the same mountain, by the way, that Moses had gone up. So in his story, he was called to help restore the true path after Israel had wandered away from the Torah and all that God had taught them and all the ways God had formed them. He called fire to rain down from heaven, and it did. It's a fantastic story if you missed it. It left him running for his life, though. And when even raining fire down from heaven didn't change things, didn't get rid of the evil that was in the world, he was depressed to the point of wanting to die. And so he goes to the mountain. He goes to the same mountain that Moses had climbed to receive the Torah. He goes there to find God. And it really feels like he had an expectation for how the meeting would go. This is how Moses met God. I'm going to go there and meet God in the same way. And he knew that God was calling him. So he gets up there, and there's this, and he hides in a crack in the rock, almost in the same way Moses does. And there's a great fire on the mountain, a fire so great that it splits rocks. But God wasn't in the fire. There's a tremendous violent wind, and God wasn't in the wind. And finally, there's silence. There's sheer, thin silence. And that silence is so heavy. Heavy's not quite the right word, is it? But there is such presence in that silence that Elijah hides his face because he can't bear to look at the silence. And in it, he finds God. He has an expectation of how he's going to meet God. But it seems to me was that what he really wanted was control. Everything he had done for trying to restore the faith in Israel and the Torah to Israel, everything that he had done that was so successful still wasn't enough. When everything else had fallen apart, he wanted to feel in control, even in how he would meet God, even in how God would show up. But of course, God shows up in God's own way, and there's not much we can do about that. There are two very different types of the same control, aren't they? Moses wanting assurance, wanting reassurance, wanting to know that God was in control. And Elijah, with the world actively falling apart around him, wanting to grab on to some kind of control, trying to control even his relationship with God, wanting God to react the way he wanted him to. Two very different types of the same control. So now, this week's story. Jesus goes up the mountain. And by the way, it is the very same mountain that Moses climbed, the very same mountain that Elijah climbed. Jesus goes and he takes 3 of his disciples with him, Peter, James, and John. Here's how the story goes. It's Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 10. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. He, Jesus, was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they had been bleached white. And by the way, you didn't see very many bright white clothes in ancient times, but here's Jesus glowing. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all this by saying to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He said this, Mark the gospel writer writes, he said this because he didn't know how to respond. For the 3 of them were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the human one, Jesus, had risen from the dead. And so they kept it to themselves, wondering, "What is this rising from the dead?" And so, once again, they go up the mountain, and once again, God's glory is there in radiance, in clarity, in authority. And this time, they seem to be completely caught off guard by it. I don't think they knew what to expect, but what they found certainly wasn't it. And how does Peter react? Mark even says Peter didn't know what he was saying. He says, "Let's make 3 shrines. I don't know, let's set up a little altar or something." He does, in some of the other Gospels and some of the other translations, they talk about building shelters, almost like they want to hang on to it for a while, or a tent. But Mark is so honest about it. Peter didn't know what he was saying. He was just kind of babbling because he couldn't handle the glory that he had just seen and the surprise of it all. So dumbfounded that I think we can forgive him for not entirely making sense. But even in his dumbfoundedness, do you hear Peter's desire for control? He has a hard time just letting it happen. It's so difficult to just stand there in awe of what he was seeing. Instead, he wants to wrap his arms around it somehow. He wants to, contain it somehow, to build shrines or a tent or a shelter, as it's sometimes translated. It's like he wants to make a plan. It's like, "Oh my goodness, this is amazing. We need to do something with it. Let's make a list of next steps." It's a different type of control, but that's the first place he goes, to try to hold on to it, to try to dwell in it. And so if Moses' desire for control comes from reassurance, and Elijah's desire for control comes out in expectation, I might describe Peter's as coming out in an attempt to manage it, in an attempt to control it, in an attempt to hold on to it. All 3 of these great figures had control issues. At least in this moment, at least when they encountered God most directly. All 3 of them were faced with real turmoil in their life. All 3 were faithful and courageous and sincere. And all 3 met God in a way that disrupted any of their attempts to control it. And I think that tells us something important. This isn't about bad, weak people with control issues. It's about honest human beings trying to survive uncertainty. Of course they desire certainty. Who wouldn't? How could we not? Moses looked for it in reassurance. Elijah looked for it with 2 strong expectations. Peter in trying to plan what couldn't be planned. But in each case, God gave them exactly what they needed. Not control, but a renewed sense that the only way forward was to have faith. None of us can grasp all that God is doing. In the end, any control that we do grasp is only an illusion. The only way forward is faith. I don't think this is actually a sermon about control. I think it's actually a sermon about trust and how we find it. And learning to trust what God is doing means giving up thinking we know what God is doing. So, here's what you need to do today. And you might not get this when I first say it, but hear me out. Here's what you need to do today. Adopt a posture of curiosity. Now, think about curiosity for a moment. Curiosity starts with the assumption that God is working. You know, if you're curious what God is up to, do you see the assumption in there? You wouldn't be curious if you didn't think God wasn't doing anything at all. So starting with a posture of curiosity is already assuming that God is there and that God is working. Curiosity implies a trust. It assumes that we will find God and that whatever God is doing is something good and something worth tacking onto if we only look hard enough for it. And curiosity is hopeful. It's looking for a better future that it knows is there. It assumes that there is good if only we look hard enough to find it. Moses, Elijah, and Peter, they all found God differently in ways they couldn't have expected. And their biggest block, their biggest barrier to get there was getting over their own expectations before they were able to receive it. Starting with curiosity just might put you a step ahead of even then. And it makes me think of one of the classic quotes from my own favorite Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I want to show you a brief clip where he says it. Now, you should know, this clip is actually from a different time, but the time he's most famous for saying this was right after 9/11, right after the attacks on the World Trade Center. The country was literally under attack. The illusion of invincibility was broken in that moment, and there was still very real fear of more attacks in the moment. And into it, he said this.
My mother used to say, whenever there would be any really catastrophe that was in the movies or on the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, even just on the sidelines. That's why I think that if news programs could make a conscious effort of showing rescue teams, of showing medical people, anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, to be sure that they include that. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope.
Do you hear the posture of curiosity in that? There are always helpers. And sometimes the curiosity will show you good even beyond what you might strictly define as a helper. If you look at the things that we are encountering on the news and on social media, so many of those stories are, well, to be honest, they're written to make us angry. They're written in a way because that keeps us on the social media platform longer, right? But if we instead approach it with an attitude of curiosity, with a posture of curiosity, looking for what God is doing in the midst of it, actively looking for it, I promise, well, not only will you find it, not only will you see God at work, but you will be more hopeful. You will find what God is doing, and you will have that kind of encounter too. Curiosity takes our fear and it turns it into a longing. Not an empty longing, but a longing that knows that God's work is already there. We just haven't found it yet. Curiosity may be the antidote to living well when the world around us is in turmoil. But it doesn't happen accidentally. Sometimes the fear is so great that we have to stop ourselves. We have to say, no, I'm in a bad pattern. And we have to intentionally say, I wonder where I'll find good in this. I wonder. Sometimes it takes downright discipline to live life with that kind of curiosity. We have to guard our minds for when fear and anxiety get the best of us. We have to intentionally tilt our head and say, I wonder. And I'm serious, physically, do this. And watch how it changes this. Curiosity really does trade our unhealthy need for control and replace it with trust. And I promise you, trust feels a lot less scary when you begin to see how God is at work. The question isn't, how do I get more control, or however you ask that question, reassurance, expectation, making plans. The better question is, what posture will I choose when I don't have control? Fear makes us miserable, but curiosity fills us with trust and hope. May you look for the helpers as you walk down from the mountain back into the messy world. And may you always be wondering what God is up to now. Would you pray with me? Oh God, thank you for wonder. Both the wonder that you give us when we see and feel amazing things like Moses, Elijah, and the disciples on the mountain, like the images we held in our minds when we prayed earlier. But thank you also for wonder in the sense of, I wonder where you are now, God. Give us eyes to see. Help us to be curious on purpose. And show us, O God, what you want us to see. May we be filled with hope. Amen.